People came to these places, and they got better. Not spiritually better, physically better. Legs that had failed for years began to hold weight. Eyes that had clouded cleared. Skin conditions that had persisted through every available treatment receded. This was not reported once. It was reported thousands of times at the same locations by people who had no contact with each other, across 3 centuries, in documented registers maintained by the institutions that ran the sites. The healing was the point. The healing was why they came. And then someone looked at the geological maps of the sites where the healing clustered most. Lourdes at the foot of the Pyrenees, Walsingham above its ancient aquifer, Canterbury built into a chalk formation riddled with spring water, and found something that had nothing to do with saints. Every one of those locations sits at or near a geological boundary. Everyone produces spring water emerging from fractured rock. Everyone generates from its very geology an atmospheric environment that modern science has spent the last 60 years studying for its effects on human biology. Nobody in 1538 studied any of this. That was the year Henry VIII's commissioners arrived. They looked at the records of healing and called it superstition. They sealed the wells. They stripped the shrines. They burned what they could carry. A woman named Lady Richelde de Faverges had built the first shrine at Walsingham in 1061, beside a holy well she had found there. Every English monarch from Henry III to Henry VIII had made the journey to visit it. Then in a single year, it was gone. The well was sealed. And the question of what had been happening at that site for 500 years was reclassified before anyone thought to ask it. If you enjoy these stories, then support the channel by liking and subscribing. Thank you. The official account of the great European pilgrimage sites is devotional through and through. Pilgrims came seeking divine intervention. Saints interceded. Miracles occurred through the grace of God, acting on sincere faith. This is how the Church framed it, how the Reformation attacked it, and how the Enlightenment dismissed it. The frameworks changed, but the assumptions stayed fixed. Whatever happened at these sites was a matter of belief, not environment. The healing was either miraculous or it was fabricated. Those were the only 2 categories anyone offered. What was never placed on the table was a third possibility: that the sites themselves were doing something, that the specific physical conditions at these locations, the mineral content of the water, the atmospheric chemistry of the enclosed grottos and spring chambers, the particular geology of the ground those structures sat on, were producing effects in the human body independent of faith, independent of belief, independent of whether the pilgrim had walked 300 miles in bare feet or arrived by cart. The effects happened. The records show they happened. The question that was never formally asked is why they happened at these places and not at others. Consider what the major sites have in common. Lourdes sits at the base of the Pyrenees where the mountain range meets the lowland plains of southern France. Directly on a karst limestone formation riddled with underground channels and fault-adjacent geology. The Massabielle Spring, where pilgrims have bathed since 1858, emerges from fractured limestone inside a cave grotto. That grotto is enclosed, stone-walled, perpetually humid, fed by water that has traveled through kilometers of fractured rock before emerging at the surface. A geochemical study published in 2017 in the Annales Societatis Geologorum Poloniae analyzed the spring waters of the Lourdes area and documented geologically conditioned differences in trace element profiles between the springs, meaning the water chemistry at Massabielle reflects the specific mineral composition of the rock it passed through. Canterbury sits above a chalk aquifer. Chalk aquifers produce springs. The Thomas Becket Shrine was built directly over the site in the cathedral, where Becket was murdered in 1170, and within 10 years of his death, the monks at Canterbury had registered more than 700 healing claims attributed to the site. The categories recorded are specific: blindness and visual disturbance, epileptic episodes, skin conditions including leprosy, deafness, respiratory complaints. These were not vague reports of feeling better. These were categorical claims about named symptoms in named people, written down by monks who had reason to be careful because these records supported the shrine's spiritual authority and the income that came with it. Walsingham in Norfolk sits in a river valley above an ancient water table. The shrine, founded by Lady Richelde in 1061, was built around a holy well, a natural spring that had been considered sacred before any Christian framework arrived to name it. Medieval records documented 2 healing wells at the priory site, along with a medicinal bath, and pilgrims traveled from across Britain and Europe to use them. Every English monarch for 300 years made the journey there. Here is the pattern when you look at these 3 sites together. Each one is a geological spring environment. Each one produces water emerging from fractured rock. Each one developed a healing reputation at or around the water source before the saint's story was layered on top. The saint did not create the reputation. The saint arrived to explain a reputation that already existed. This matters because of what we now know about the atmospheric chemistry of geological spring environments, and specifically about the air at sites where water moves through and over fractured mineral-bearing rock. Negative air ions are oxygen molecules that carry an extra electron. They form primarily in 2 conditions: near moving or falling water, and through the process of radioactive decay in fractured rock, specifically through the release and decay of radon gas from fractured igneous and sedimentary formations. Fault lines and fractured rock systems produce elevated concentrations of dissolved radon in groundwater. As that water moves through rock and emerges at springs, radon escapes into the surrounding air. Each radon atom that decays produces tens of thousands of ion pairs. The enclosed stone chambers where spring water emerges, grottos, cave shrines, sealed spring rooms inside medieval shrine structures, concentrate this ionized air. You cannot see it, you cannot taste it, but the body responds to it. The research on this has been running for decades. In experiments at Columbia University, researcher Michael Terman found that exposure to high concentrations of negative ions reduced symptoms of depression as effectively as antidepressants. The BMC Psychiatry meta-analysis, published in 2013, examined 33 studies conducted between 1957 and 2012, and found that negative ionization was significantly associated with lower depression ratings, with the strongest effect observed at high exposure densities. The physiological mechanism runs through serotonin. High negative ions modulate serotonin levels in the brain, the same neurotransmitter system implicated in mood regulation, sleep, pain perception, and immune response. Consider that category of effects. Now look again at what the medieval miracle registers recorded: mood disturbances improving, sleep disorders resolving, pain syndromes lifting, skin conditions receding, respiratory complaints clearing. Not all healing, not limbs regrowing, not organ failures reversing, but a specific, consistent cluster of conditions resolving at these specific locations. That cluster is the data. The sites where healing concentrated were sites with enclosed spring chambers and fault-adjacent geology, the precise conditions that produce the highest natural concentrations of negative air ions. Indoors, near ground level, away from moving water, negative ion concentrations typically fall below 100 per cubic centimeter. Near waterfalls and at geological spring openings, concentrations reach tens of thousands per cubic centimeter. The Mesabiel Grotto at Lourdes, enclosed stone, running water, humid air, concentrates these conditions. The spring chambers beneath medieval English shrines held the same atmospheric profile. The body of a pilgrim stepping into that grotto was stepping into an environment their body had evolved alongside, but rarely encountered at such intensity. The ailments that resolved most consistently were not random. They were the ailments that respond to precisely this kind of atmospheric and mineral water exposure. If you've made it this far, you now know more than 99% of people. Now come back to the core problem. 500 years of healing reports. I concentrated at specific locations that share specific physical properties. A pattern so consistent it generated an international infrastructure of travel, accommodation, and record-keeping that persisted for centuries. Whatever was happening at these sites, it was reliable enough to sustain that infrastructure. Faith alone does not produce a 700-claim healing register in 10 years. Faith generates pilgrims. These sites generated results that brought the pilgrims back, that spread the reputation by word of mouth from one town to the next, that drew every English monarch for 300 years to walk barefoot on a cold Norfolk road to reach a holy well in a river valley. But the pattern runs deeper than the medieval period, much deeper. The pre-Christian record makes the pattern impossible to dismiss. The healing reputation at virtually every major European pilgrimage site predates the Christian story by centuries, because the sites were sacred long before Christianity arrived to name them. Bath, England, sits above thermal springs. The Romans built their healing baths there because the springs had been considered sacred long before Rome arrived. A Christian shrine was built at the same location in the medieval period for the same reason. Spa, Belgium. The word spa itself derives from the mineral spring town, was documented by Roman writers and continuously used for its waters from the Roman period forward, with a Christian framework arriving later to manage a reputation that already existed. The healing at these sites was not generated by the Christian framework that later claimed it. The healing was there before, at the water, at the rock, at the particular atmospheric conditions those geological formations produce. This pattern holds across cultures that share no theological tradition. Major Hindu pilgrimage sites in the Himalayas sit at high elevation, where atmospheric ionization from cosmic radiation is measurably higher. Indigenous sacred sites documented across the Americas cluster at geological features: fault zones, mineral springs, elevated karst formations. The specific physical profile appears at sites that developed healing reputations independently, in cultures with no shared theology, on different continents, over thousands of years. The pattern is not in the faith. The pattern is in the ground. At Canterbury, the monks kept the records because the records served their institutional purpose. They documented 700 healing claims in 10 years, not to advance science, but to support the shrine's legitimacy. They did not know they were creating a physiological data set. They thought they were documenting miracles. But the categories they recorded with careful specificity, the visual disturbances, the epileptic episodes, the skin conditions, the respiratory complaints, were recorded because those were the conditions that most consistently resolved. The body of data they maintained is inadvertent evidence about what the environment at Canterbury was doing to human biology. Here is Lady Receded in 1061, before there were monks, before there was a priory, before there were records. She's a Saxon noblewoman, recently widowed, managing an estate in the Norfolk lowlands. She finds a spring in the countryside near her village of Walsingham. The local understanding, carried forward from well before any Christian community existed in that valley, is that the water does something. She builds a structure around it, not beside it. Around it, the spring chamber at the center, the walls built to enclose and concentrate the air of the enclosed water source. This is a decision that requires no theological framework to explain. The spring produces a specific environment. She's building a container for that environment. Stand where the original structure stood. Cold stone underfoot, the smell of mineral water heavy in enclosed air, the particular humidity of a space that has never fully dried since the water table first pushed through, and the choice of site stops being mysterious. Whatever Lady Receded understood about what that water did to the body, she understood enough to put the shrine there and nowhere else, and to make the water the organizing fact of the entire structure. We walk these sites now and call them devotional. We come for the architecture, for the quiet, for something we describe in spiritual terms because we inherited a vocabulary that has no other words for what these places do. The springs still flow. The water still emerges from the same fractured rock it emerged from when the medieval registries were being filled. The grottos still concentrate the same air chemistry. The body responds to that chemistry the same way it did in the 12th century, and in the 9th, and long before that. In 1538, Thomas Cromwell's injunctions reclassified what was happening at these sites as superstition. Not disproved, reclassified. The distinction matters. Disproving a claim requires examining the claim, gathering evidence, testing it against alternatives. Cromwell's commissioners did none of that. They arrived with the verdict already decided, stripped the shrines of their wealth, sealed the wells, and filed the healing registers under the broader category of Catholic fabrication. The Enlightenment, a century and a half later, confirmed the judgment in secular terms. Superstition became irrationality. The vocabulary updated. The erasure continued. What closed with the shrines in 1538 was not just a religious practice. It was a data archive. The accumulated records of what bodies experience at these specific locations, what symptoms resolved, how consistently, at which sites, were classified as delusion and discarded. The question of mechanism was never asked because the effect had been reclassified as impossible. You cannot investigate a phenomenon you have decided does not exist. There were people inside those institutions who understood what was being closed. The monks at Canterbury had watched 700 cases unfold over 10 years. They had seen which ailments resolved most consistently, had noticed, even if they never wrote it down in those terms, that the categories of healing clustered. The canons at Walsingham had managed the healing wells for 300 years. They had drawn the water, administered the bath, watched the pilgrims who drank from the well and the pilgrims who did not. They had seen what the water did. They didn't have a framework for explaining it that would survive the Reformation scrutiny. They had only the theological vocabulary they'd inherited. When that vocabulary was declared fraudulent, the observations went with it. The data was filed under the verdict, not examined before it. The Massabielle grotto at Lourdes is cold in a way that is specific to enclosed stone and moving water. The air sits at your skin differently than outdoor air, heavier, charged. Pilgrims have described this quality for 160 years in the language available to them: holy, sacred, different. The physiological vocabulary for what they were describing did not exist until the 20th century. I've looked at the Lourdes Medical Bureau's documented files. The Bureau, established in 1882, has verified 70 cases that their investigators determined could not be explained by existing medical knowledge. 70 cases meeting stringent criteria across a site visited by millions over a century and a half. The Bureau investigates whether the healing is miraculous. It has not formally examined the geochemical profile of the Massabielle spring against the documented categories of healing. It has not measured the ion concentration inside the grotto at peak pilgrimage conditions. The physical environment of the site has not been the subject of systematic investigation. The investigation has focused consistently on whether the healing is miraculous, because that is the question the Reformation handed down as the only legitimate question to ask. The healing was documented. The mechanism was never investigated. The sites were closed and the records reclassified before anyone asked what the ground was doing to the body. That is the conclusion the evidence supports. Not that the miracles were divine, not that they were fabricated. That an empirical question, why did these specific locations produce these specific effects in these specific categories of human illness, was never asked, because it was reclassified out of existence before it could be held still long enough to examine. Lady Richeldis's well is still there. Beneath the current Anglican shrine at Walsingham, water still moves through the same aquifer it moved through in 1061. The mineral content of that water has been noted in passing, but never formally compared against the medieval records of what people said it healed. The spring chamber still concentrates what it has always concentrated. The well was sealed in 1538. The records were closed that same year. The question is still waiting.